Oh, okay, great. I'm going to turn off the screen recording if I can figure out how to do that. And I will jump in to be very excited to introduce our presenters today. So we have TaKaya McFarland and Isabela Peña, and who have been our amazing co-op students this semester. They have been working very hard on a million things in our department, and they're going to be highlighting just one of the things that they've developed a lot of expertise around during their time here in their scholarly projects. And so I will let you guys take it away. You probably decided who's going first.
Okay, so I'll see if I can maybe okay, perfect. Oh, it says that I can control the screen, but okay, I'm sure. Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Isabela Peña, and we're gonna present our scholarly project. So I'm gonna start by presenting my project, and then TaKaya will present hers, and then we'll open a time for questions. So my project is the educational inclusivity and psychosis, understanding barriers, clinician attitudes, and building bridges. So, okay. So my hypothesis for the project is that, I'm sorry, first, the literature findings, I'm gonna start discussing what I found in the literature that was most important for my project and why did I decide to go for this topic. And the literature finding review underscores the effectiveness of early intervention in psychosis, working with educational bodies to reintegrate youth experiencing clinical high-risk psychosis and first episodes of psychosis into education. So students face typical high school challenges, but they also face challenges due to their conditions. And their sense of belonging and social inclusion is impacted by the school environment. And this is a great factor which influence how they are integrated into school life and how they are going to be successful in their academics in the future. So also the literature highlights the need for better organizational collaboration to support these students and emphasize the importance of educational engagement in recovery. It suggests that having dedicated vocational workers and partnerships with local educational providers can significantly aid students' educational recovery and journeys. So the hypothesis here is that high schools that successful support students with clinical high risk for psychosis depend on clinical attitudes and the inclusivity and diversity of the school setting, combining a welcoming educational climate with positive clinical practices that enhance reintegration and academic achievement for these students. So what we did is that based on Harini Suresh and Emily Klein's form, we collected data from clinicians working in a high school in Massachusetts. So from an outreach that the response to risk team did, then we collected these responses, and we added a section to measure school inclusivity, race, ethnicity, and social economic status. In total, we collected 77 responses from these clinicians, and then we conducted different statistical analyses such as ANOVAs, t-test, and descriptive analysis. So the goals of the Microsoft form was to assess the confidence levels in school and staff for identify and screening for clinical high risk for psychosis, also identifying the most significant barriers preventing for accessing care, and analyze the current knowledge and awareness within the schools about clinical high risk for psychosis, and examine the most common fears and misconceptions. So we are analyzing three main categories here. One is familiarity, the other one is screening confidence, and the other one is school inclusivity. So the demographics here, we can see that the majority of the schools are actually white, and followed by around 10%, 25 to 50%, then followed by Black or African American. And we have little demographics from other races like Native Hawaiian, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, Asian or Asian American, and Hispanics or Latinos. So this is something to consider, the outreach that we're doing. Most of the clinicians that are assisting, these come from mainly white high schools. And then the type of providers and how long they have been in the field. The most providers that we have are counselors, followed by social workers, and we don't have respondents from psychiatrists or teachers, and the majority of the respondents have been in their positions from 10 to 20 years, followed by the next group who have been in the position from 1 to 3 years. So here is the first data set. We look at psychosis familiarity in different school settings by racial diversity. So here the data shows a statistical significance of 0.05. And we can see a trend here that racial diversity in schools seem to be associated with higher psychosis familiarity for Black students and lower for white students, while social economic status doesn't show a clear pattern. This is something that we're gonna go back in the discussion section and see what possible explanations for this data set could exist. Also in the screening confidence, we can see a statistical significance of 0.052 compared to psychosis. So clinicians were more confident screening for anxiety, depression, followed by trauma, followed by substance abuse, and the least confident they were was in psychosis, with just above 1.5 out of 5 of confidence. We measure inclusivity, and we found that there were no significant associations between school inclusivity, race, and socioeconomic demographics. But we do find that student support of mental health and student support of psychosis were highly correlated with the 0.01, and inclusivity at school was not correlated with provider confidence or familiarity. But we did find that the more familiar the provider is with psychosis, the more supportive the students are with their peers experiencing psychosis. So that was an interesting finding. We also measure how do the school respond, if the school responds proactively and supportively when a student is identified as having a mental health concern versus identified for psychosis specifically. And here we found a highly correlation level of 0.001. And this would suggest that the clinicians perceive that the school is more supportive when a student is identified with mental health concerns compared to those experiencing psychosis specifically. And also there's a strong positive correlation here. We see a significant difference between those two levels of supports. We also measure the same here, and we can see the same trend. This question was if the students are supportive and understanding towards their peers who experience mental health support versus psychosis specifically. And also we conducted a per sample t-test to see this, and we can see for the mean for general support was 3.1 versus the mean for psychosis was 2.7. This also indicates that there highly positively correlated with 0.001. So we can see the same trend here. There's more support for general mental health concerns than for psychosis specifically. Then we ask some qualitative data, and we ask the clinicians what were the biggest barriers in accessing care. The most common one was stigma. Then a lot of them answer lack of awareness and understanding, availability and accessibility of service, insurance and financial barriers are a big one too, the recognition and diagnosis. Also, it came cultural factors as a very significant barrier, and various systemic issues. So in the discussion section, we can see that it is crucial. There's a crucial role of inclusive educational settings and clinical attitudes to be able to reintegrate students in educational settings that are experiencing clinical high risk of psychosis. We can also see that one of the biggest barriers to achieve a communal climate is the stigma and lack of understanding from both peers and providers. And also we can see that there's an opportunity to create a more inclusive schools by training providers, because we can see in the data that the more familiar the provider is with psychosis, the more supportive the school is. And some of the limitations that we encounter in this analysis was that the data for race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status were an estimate and not directly obtained from the participants. We asked the clinicians to estimate the races in their schools. And also there's a lack of data of the clinicians' racial or cultural backgrounds, which this could also impact the study findings. And these limitations might influence the interpretation of results, and they should be considered when evaluating the conclusions of the study. And a further remark could be a possible explanation of the data of the familiarity trends. This was a data that we weren't expecting. So there could be many possible explanations from why the wider the school is, the less familiar the providers are with psychosis, and the other way around. So there could be many explanations to this, but it's something to think about it, and to think about the implications and cultural backgrounds, and maybe the information that's out there. And these are all of my references, and now I'm gonna give the word to TaKaya so she can present her.
Would it make sense for there to be a couple of questions before TaKaya starts? Do you want to guys just keep going and then ask our questions at the end?
Yeah, asking questions at the end would probably be preferable.
Awesome.
Thank you, Isabella. And hello, everybody. My project was on assessing barriers to equitable access to medical care and research across intersectional social identities. Here are some of the topics that will be covered. And my question focused on how social determinants of health, such as immigration status, ethnicity and race, and intergenerational cultural differences affect access to research and clinical care for minority groups in the Boston area. And before I kind of get into a little bit of my topic, I wanted to talk about my specific interest in this topic. I'm a student at Northeastern University, and in that time, I've taken courses such as childhood adversity and childhood experiences, clinical psychology and developmental psychology that have really shaped my interest in psychology, but specifically in childhood adversity and childhood experiences. I learned about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, and I kind of use a similar model in what I determined to be intersectionality that I'll talk a little bit about later in my presentation. I also have synophysitionality, I grew up as a military child in my younger adolescence, and then as I got older, I lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood in a predominantly Black county in Maryland. And through this, I grew up around different cultures and got to see the different treatment around me of specific people, and that led me into an interest of community advancement and wellness, especially in research in the healthcare system. And then doing literature review during my time here, I was able to look at articles that focus on equity and access to services and the likelihood of marginalized communities continuing in research studies, which are kind of my first two resources here. And then because of this, I was able also to kind of dive deeper into what happens when care is prolonged and symptoms remain untreated. I also want to take time to kind of look at just regular literature. I am really interested in Black feminism, and the writers of Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, and Patricia Hill Collins really shaped my interest, especially in their focus on how oppression impacts the intersectional identities of Black women in America. And specifically, Patricia Hill Collins talks in her work about the idea of intersectionality and how it opens to the possibility of seeing and understanding more spaces of cross-cutting, especially as being a Black woman. So those are my specific interests in this topic. To get into the purpose and my hypothesis, the purpose of this experiment was to conduct a critical review of MapNet and data repository data, which is a part of the response to risk data. And I hypothesized that the lack of understanding intersectionality affects the access to care and research for minority groups. And through this analysis, I hope to suggest more inclusive research studies and ways to conduct clinical assessments. And again, looking through my lens of race, ethnicity, immigration status, and intergenerational cultural differences, the first two are pretty self-explanatory, but I kind of want to talk about how I kind of delve deeper into what is intergenerational cultural differences and experiences. And so I use two separate definitions. I use the American Psychological Association's definition of culture and Merriam-Webster's definition of intergenerational to define these. And Merriam-Webster's defines intergenerational as the existing or occurring between generations. And APA defines culture as both the distinctive customs and values, beliefs, knowledge, art, and language of a society or of a community, and the characteristics, attitudes, behaviors of a particular group within a society. And because of this, I made the connections of religion, schooling, gender identity, sexual orientation, and household income to be determining factors of what can be considered intergenerational cultural differences. Uh-oh. Alrighty, back on track. So for my study design and analysis, I used two different data sets: the response to risk data repository and the Massachusetts Psychosis Network for Early Treatment, or MapNet data. I do want to take some time to note that data repository isn't representative of all response to risk participants, just for that specific set of people. And statistical analysis that I used were descriptive statistics, chi-squares, and ANOVAs. So the first thing that I wanted to kind of discuss was the demographics of the data set. Overwhelmingly, it was about 18 years of age, with predominantly white cis females being the predominant race and gender. I also wanted to take some time to look at the multiracial race category, as that's the second highest, even though it's only 4 participants, race category that we saw in our participants. And I want to take time to speak about this because race is a social construct, and certain people have different experiences based on how they perceive themselves, and also how they are treated based on that perception. And the operationalization of race can really encourage and discourage certain discussions among data collection. And I think this kind of shows my interest in this and understanding the nuances of certain minority groups and what it means to be in a minority. Here are some other demographics that kind of talk about some of my other variables that I looked at: immigration status, mainly being seen to be born in the USA, not first or second generation immigrant. Citizen status, being US or Canadian citizen, being born in the US, yes. Household income, many prefer not to answer, which I will talk a little bit about in a bit. And past and current religion affiliations, being Christian. So I kind of broke down my analysis into 3 parts. The first part being kind of the basics and looking at the basic basic statistics with the demographics, but I had to kind of create 3 new variables for this. The first being a difference in religion. Difference in religion being the difference from if there's a difference from growing up in the religion and then still affiliating with that religion currently. And of the 30 participants who completed the question, 60% or 18 participants had no difference between their raised and current religious beliefs. Of the SIPS status, being SIPS is how we kind of measure for clinical high risk for first episode of psychosis. Of those 41 participants, 43% or 43.9%, which is 18 participants, were found to be at clinical high risk or CHR. Other options were they were neither CHR or FEP, again, FEP being first episode of psychosis, FEP, ineligible, or they lost contact. And CHR continuation, which is of those who did rate at CHR, 44% of one study, and the others were either not interested, were participants in 2 studies, or were not a US citizen. And this is really important, and I'll talk about why I decided to continue to use this person's explanation in the future slides. So what I did was with the SIP status and the continuation, if they were at CHR, I looked at all the different variables and compared them. And so the first thing that I saw was with race and ethnicity and SIP status. So I do also want to take the time to talk about that not every single statistic was significantly significant because there were only about 41 people that were reviewed, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't still interesting data. So here we have that the white participants were the only ones to be at either CHR, which is here, or FEP. And the Central and South American participants were both ineligible to complete the SIPs due to Wi-Fi connection issues or of cognitive disability, which is autism. And I do believe that this could be said to be predetermined factors of being a part of certain groups that could lead to stressors of institutionalized discrimination can affect, such as like access to certain resources. I do also want to talk about race and ethnicity and the clinical high-risk outcomes. It was really noticeable that the white participants were more likely to not continue in the study compared to their counterparts who at CHR typically participated in 1 study or more. The next thing I want to talk about is household income and the SIPS rating. It can be said, obviously, that overwhelmingly, a lot of participants didn't know their household income, and this could be because of a few reasons. One being that they're in college or even in high school, so they just don't know. And others could just be because they just don't understand or don't know at that time. But aside from this, if you look, there's kind of a lateral difference from left to right. And from the higher outcome level, there seems to be more varied outcomes than the lower income. As you can see, in the households that make 10,000 or less, they were more likely to be at CHR. And for the household incomes that are at 100,000 and above, they tend to have either at CHR or FEP, ineligible, or they lost contact, which was a really interesting finding. And then also, again, talking about household income and the CHR outcomes, we kind of see that same scalar difference. But in this case, it becomes that the higher the incomes, the more likely they are to complete 2 studies than the households with lower incomes where they were either don't continue or they only completed 1 study. This can be because of the time commitment, but also this could be because a lot of those families that we see are probably in the 100,000 range, and there is the uplift study at response to risk that is family focused. In my future studies, I would really love to look more closely at this and have a better understanding of why that reasoning might be. And then finally, in this section, I want to discuss the difference in religion and the CHR outcomes. There is something to be said that where there was a difference in religious studies, they were more likely to complete at least 1 study. But here, as you can see, where there may be no difference from the religion they were raised and the religion they currently affiliate with, they were not interested in continuing with the study. And religion can be a very strong factor for people when it comes to treatment and research, and those who still identify with their religion could have a strong affinity for it. And thus, for some cultures, religion can play a big role in a part of identity and can influence the decision regarding treatment and continuing with research. The next thing that I want to talk about is, again, my question really focuses on minority groups. And with this being said, I wanted to talk about marginalized groups. And this was dependent and kind of determined based on literature reviews and readings and specific research in the Boston area. And here are kind of what these marginalized groups were combined to. So we looked at marginalized groups and non-marginalized groups. And I wanted to take specific note at the household income being 73,000. Doing some math, I was able to find that based on the average household income and also the cost of living in Boston, 73,000 seemed to be around the marginalized group, 70,000 and less. But there was kind of miscategorization where we saw for the other household incomes, it was about 10,000 gaps. So like 10,000 to 20,000, 20,000 to 30. But here we saw that 60,000 to 99,000 was grouped together, which could lead to miscategorization. And to talk a little bit about the outcomes of this, for marginalized income and SIP status, it was seen that marginalized communities were overwhelmingly determined to be at clinical high risk. And this was pretty significant considering that compared to the non-marginalized communities, there was significantly less participants in the marginalized group. So that could be a really interesting finding. And also to talk about race and ethnicity and the SIP status, it was seen that marginalized groups were rated to be at CHR or FEP, and they were the only group that was ineligible to complete the SIPs. And in the marginalized groups, it was neither CHR or FEP, or they were at CHR simply lost contact. This was another specifically significant finding that could possibly show discrepancies in the way that ratings could possibly be occurring. And there were some important things that I really wanted to hit on while looking at this data. Again, not everything is always going to be significantly statistic, but some of the trends that are occurring in these data should be kind of brought up. And that being said, while looking at the data, one thing that I noticed was that non-marginalized groups were more likely to continue with the study. And this could be said that those who don't experience institutionalized discrimination may feel they don't have to continue with the study because they have access to the healthcare systems more easily than marginalized communities. And marginalized communities may rely on these studies not only for care, but possible financial compensation as well, as most research studies are typically compensated. Another thing I noticed is that marginalized communities and groups overwhelmingly were seen to be at CHR more than non-marginalized groups. Again, this could be because of the way that the ratings are happening, but another thing that I wanted to bring up was that these studies may be the only way that marginalized people are able to get the answers of what's the symptoms that they are experiencing, and being turned away or given false hope from previous experiences in the healthcare system can give them the answers that they're looking for. And this is why it's so important to continually evaluate the assessments that we give out and the general outreach that we're doing, because it may not be discriminatory basis on our end, but that could be causing these differences. But instead, it's the people that are taking a chance in the healthcare system that to this day continues to teach and reach harmful discriminatory practices. And now I kind of want to end on my intersectionality note, which is a new variable that I previously said I defined using the ACEs model, which basically says that the more marginalized or the more adverse childhood experiences somebody has, the more likely they are to be susceptible to illnesses and other things of that nature. So I basically use the same thing, counting individually for each patient or participant, the number of marginalized identities each one had. And through this, I was able to find a really interesting finding. But before I get into that, I wanted to kind of talk about the more prevalent stats that we saw. We mainly saw that the people who had one or two marginalized identities were the ones that we saw more frequently. And there was one person who had 6 marginalized identities, which I will talk a little bit about now. For the CHR outcomes, we were able to see kind of that an increase of identities decreased the participation in multiple studies. So those who had a 4.63, so about 4 to 5 marginalized identities, were more likely to participate in one study, and those who had about 2 to 3 at 2.67 were more likely to participate in 2 studies. And again, this could be because of the pressure and constraints of being a marginalized person could have. This could also be about the time and things like that nature. So I'd love to do more research on that. And it could also be said that those who had about 3 or 4 marginalized identities were not interested in completing the study. Something that I really wanted to add and that I told you all from the beginning that I would come back to is that the person who had 6 marginalized identities was not a US citizen and therefore wouldn't be able to continue with the study because they probably they couldn't get paid or things like that, or they just couldn't participate, which really sucks because we know, like, as I said in the beginning during my literature review, duration of untreated psychosis can really be harmful to the person. And this person unfortunately couldn't, if this was their way of trying to get help, they wouldn't be able to receive it this way. And yeah. And so to kind of talk about while I wrap up and end, my hypothesis seems to be agreeable, but more research definitely needs to be done. I definitely want to look at the symptomology of these reports and see how that lines up. Are we seeing that more people of color are having the suspicious symptom or suspicious rating higher than their white peers, and what that kind of looks like? And also using the MatNet data, which I recently was able to get access to. So unfortunately, I couldn't use that data in this analysis, but in the future, I would love to look more into this data and see what the access to care looks like as well on a larger scale. I definitely also want to expand my knowledge on how intersectionality is measured, not just in psychosis, not just in mental health, but in the healthcare systems in general, and kind of build upon that model. Also want to look at more specific cases, just like the case of the person who wasn't a US citizen, but had those marginalized identities, what that kind of looks like. And then also speaking to professionals to kind of get their understanding of intersectionality and the access to care and research that they have, professionals being those who've lived experience and clinicians. Thank you for your time. Isabella and I do have a few slides to kind of end on, to kind of talk about our experiences within To Be Epic. Here's us bridging our presentations. Isabella, would you like to start with like kind of what you learned during your experiences?
Yeah, so for sure, during our experiences, we were able to grow professionally and personally as well. I learned a lot about the barriers accessing care, and more importantly, all of the opportunities that there is in the research world, in not the research world, the outreach, to make this issue more accessible, or the resources more accessible to people and minorities. And I think both of our projects talk about how accessing to care could be obtained and achievable by having the discussion and having the information. So I think that's a huge takeaway for me. And yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. We were really able to use this kind of platform to do research on some topics that I think we can both bring very unique perspectives on. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And definitely moving forward, I do still plan, I hope to get my PhD and do more exciting research and learn more as much as I can, go back to school and learn as much as I can. This opportunity has been amazing. Isabella?
Yeah, same. I agree with TaKaya. Hopefully this had given me the experience or the exposure in the research world, but also the clinical world, and something that has been very rewarding. It's to see how much impact you can make on others people's lives. So that's definitely it's a reassurance of the path that I will continue that. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you. We hope you all will stay in contact with us. Here are our personal emails and our LinkedIn's. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Any questions we can ask now?
Y'all did that. That was amazing. Y'all smashed that. I'm very proud of the work that y'all have done. Um, I guess like I think my first question, I guess, to Isabela. Um, in terms of not having school demographics and clinician demographics, I'm wondering because I've noticed a theme between both of your presentations, sort of like the way that we need to operationalize our measurement tools definitely needs to be addressed, as well as sort of like the data that we're collecting as part of those measurement tools, as well as just like a larger issue of like equity and access across racial demographics and like who we're serving. And so I guess I wanted to ask. Would you think something like maybe even a separate survey that measures implicit bias in like clinicians or like any sort of demographics collected by the schools would be helpful in like future directions for how we shape these services?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. So, we could see like a main um theme that maybe first, of course, if we wanted to collect identifiable information, would have to go to the IRB, and that would be another process. So that's why we couldn't like ask those questions. But I think for future like directions, that would be a very good thing to consider, because that would change a lot. If we can know like the cultural background of the clinicians, we can understand if it's like a bias, maybe if it's like a something that um we are, maybe it's something about that we are not accessing more diverse communities, or maybe it's something about yeah, exactly, the racial and cultural backgrounds. But yeah, a good thing to consider is maybe increasing efforts on diversify or outreach, and see who are we emailing, and why mostly white schools are like coming in. Maybe they have more access, or maybe they are already in the loop, and it's a good thing to ask who are we not like considering or reaching out.
Absolutely. Love that. I have one question for you, TaKaya, also. I also something I did that you mentioned was sort of like the operationalization of how we collect demographics data. And I did notice like lumping like Southeast Asian and then like label specification of that was just like only South Asian identities. And so like I can see how there's some need for some updating on that. And I also was really hooked on the point that you made that participation was most likely continue with clients of color, and that there was more loss to attrition of white participants. But the demographics really indicated that our outreach was mostly overrepresenting participants of color. And I just wanted to know, like, I guess what your thoughts are and like what are some things that we could do maybe to like address those issues?
Yeah, I definitely think it's kind of reaching out to those communities. I think there's always been like this bias in the back of our, or not bias, but like something to genuinely worry about for communities of color is being used in research studies, and it's something that has definitely been done. And I know that that's something for me, like even coming into this co-op and learning about research is something that I had to kind of understand myself. And I think it kind of is going into those communities and being honest and truthful and saying like, hey, those things did happen, but we really are here to help you, and we want to understand you. And I think it really has to do with, especially things like, that's just one part of it, because there's also the institutionalized part of it that keeps them away from those systems. Like I mentioned, we did have participants who, because of Wi-Fi issues, just couldn't even the continue with the research at all. And so how can we make sure that we know that the institution has put in place barriers for people of color to get access, not only to research, but to care in general, and understanding how we can go about that and kind of dismantle those systems so that we can provide access. What could we do to support those people? Even things like maybe having like a library day. This is just an example, but like going to libraries where there is free, access, and helping those communities there, where there is free Wi-Fi that they might not even know they have access to. So just like small things like that can make a really big difference, especially knowing that deinstitutionalizing the institution is going to be really hard. So yeah, so doing the parts that we can in the community with what we have, I think is the best way to address those things.
Thanks, y'all. Y'all are amazing and brilliant and so proud of you.
Thank you.
I have a comment slash digression. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and research with us. Really wonderful presentations. I have, with regards to inclusive schools, right? And seen from the side of the provider, I work with the CEDAR team, right? And I'm following, high school students who experience CHRP, and I'm beginning to notice the difference between schools, right? I'm working, for instance, with the therapeutic schools, right, that are fully invested in the therapeutic language. So presumably it's easier to collaborate with those folks, right? As a clinician, I'm talking to another clinician on the other side. But what about other schools that may be, under-resourced, or schools who may be, I don't know, providers may be feeling very anxious, right? And they might want to just kind of like, oh, you take care of this, you rather take the lead on, and we need you to kind of like do more work for this student of us, and we're so worried about this student. So I'm beginning to see the differences, and I'm wondering as to kind of Isabela, the point you made about inclusivity, right? Does it translate into better collaboration, and how better collaboration would look like, mindful that each case is unique, and students are different, and are resourced differently as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is great to know. But yeah, I do believe that's a great point also, because in the data we could see that the more the clinicians in the school are more aware of psychosis and know how to treat psychosis, the more the inclusivity in the school was. So those two were correlated, and that's like a very hopeful message. So maybe we can increase our efforts to train clinicians or train the staff in the school, and that would impact the peer support in the school. So the school would be like not more aware and destigmatized, but more inclusive. And that would help a lot for the peers who are experiencing psychosis or clinical high risk for psychosis. According to the literature, that would increase their success in their integration of their academics. So it's very important to consider the schools that are not having these conversations, or the schools that are not trained, and maybe they don't have the resources or access. How can we provide at least the information and direct them to the right resources, so at least the clinicians know how to assess for psychosis, how to act in terms, and that could impact the whole school inclusivity or the whole school community. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's super helpful. Like the more educated the clinician is about treating these aspects. I'm also beginning to notice the patterns of, like, clients who may be on a continuum of crisis, right? And how clinicians may mirror the anxiety, or may just be very anxious themselves, and kind of like, how do you collaborate in a way that is effective and responsive to the students' need, so they stay well in school? Well, that's kind of like the question that you are answering. So thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you. One of the things that I also want to mention is that in the literature, they say that the integration of other services for the students could be also helpful, and that made me think about a research study that they made, INVEST study, that they offer like coaching and accompany like tutoring the students who are experiencing clinical high risk for psychosis, and that's like proven to be very helpful in terms of the reintegration. So I think it's super helpful for the school to have the resources, but also to have like the collaboration, the right collaborations or systems, so the students could be like fully supported. And yeah, it's a whole like many variables come to play, but I think it's important to consider these and have these questions.
Yes.
I was waiting to give other people space to comment as well, but I want to start by just expressing how impressed and proud I am of both of you and your just lovely, wonderful presentations. I learned a lot. I have a lot of things that I'm thinking about and want to follow up on. I particularly appreciate the piece of saying what you learned from the 2B Epic program, because you're doing exactly what we really like, what this program is about, which is helping to change our practices and putting a critical eye on things we're doing in order to do better. I have a few questions and comments. So with Isabela's, one of the things I'm acutely aware of is I think one thing we weren't able to look at is whether there were multiple providers from the same school that were on. So in looking at the different schools, it's hard to know like if each person represents a different school or multiple schools. Or one of the schools that I know that is has a larger Black and Latinx population that was represented in that probably was the most inclusive, best school for understanding and responding to psychosis, happens to be the school that our co-director, Dr. Kwame Dance, works at. Oh, so anyway, I will definitely be sending him this recording, and it does make me think like, wow, we should really talk to that school and Dr. Dance some more to think about how we can do better. But I do think to some extent, the findings on that may be heavily influenced by the fact that he has done an outstanding job of educating his colleagues at that school, and that we have shared several clients between Cedar and that school, which I think has led to a very nice collaboration over time. Because wow, like from your results, it would suggest that, there's, anyway, it's just interesting. And at the same time, Vera, your point about, wow, like we actually did a nice job of connecting with folks who are experiencing CHR symptoms in research and connecting them with studies. But most of our outreach reached clinicians who work at white schools. So there's clearly a disconnect there that we need to work on. And, the procedure by which we, connected, we had clinicians across Massachusetts. Invitations were sent out to thousands and thousands, probably 1,000 people. I'm sure there are a variety of factors that are not random that led to why more white clinicians had the privilege and time to be participating in that in-service meeting and to fill out the form as well. There were some folks who attended the meeting but didn't fill out the form. So anyway, that's Isabela's. And then TaKaya, I think your scale on number of marginalized identities is really interesting. And I think something that we could look at, in a number of other things as well. I think that is really novel and cool. So I just want to start with that comment. The other piece that I'm kind of interesting, I mean, there are two possibilities, right? There's a possibility that there's overdiagnosis of CHR in marginalized identity communities in our sample, right? There's also the possibility that, and Jimmy can speak more to this, and really want to give a shout out to Jimmy because I know how much supervision and, what a giant part of this he's been. But the data repository was an opportunity to maybe make our research more accessible to folks who would have a healthy level of, many reasons to not necessarily want to sign on to a long study participation without getting to know us first. So one of my, assuming we're not overdiagnosing CHR, I'm feeling kind of hopeful about the results that you shared, because we are identifying, we identified, I think it was 39% of the clients that participated in data repository were white, which I'm guessing is not too far off, like the community average. So we're kind of like that's kind of like, you know, something that's pretty good. And we didn't, you know, the connections with our clinicians and our staff did not turn people away. So you know, we had more folks who decided to, you know, participate in our studies, and I think that's good. And just anecdotally, I think that the data repository, it seemed like something that made research a little bit more accessible to people with marginalized identities, because they'd have the opportunity to get to know our staff in a lower bar. You know, it's just an assessment was all I had to sign up for. They didn't have to say, we're going to do something with you for 6 months, you know, before we could do the assessment and fill a giant, you know, consent form out. So I don't know. Do you think that's a reasonable conclusion, or am I getting a little too excited about or reading into that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's some of the things that I was like heavily considering. I think because like I didn't get to go as further as I wanted to, but I think that's why looking at things like the symptomology and like there's a bunch of other like reports in the data repository that I didn't even get time to look at. I just like skimmed it and I was like, this could be really interesting to look into. I think looking at those questions or like looking at those like data sets could also like really point to an answer, like at least help come to a backed up conclusion. Yeah.
Awesome. Also, if you compared the demographics of the data repository to our other studies, I am guessing that we would get whiter in the other studies, especially Uplift. And anyway, I'm just so grateful that you looked at that data and that we can learn from it in real time. And Vera also really noted your comment about how we the categories for, you know, that's like something we can easily fix. So I welcome your recommendations on that, and things that we might not be getting that we really should.
I just have to comment in Isabela and TaKaya, both of your projects were wonderful, really wonderful job doing the presentation. It's just been such a joy and to be able to be a part of this kind of learning as we go along. And I'm really, you know, leaving both of these conversations and presentations with a real kind of consideration of you know, continuing to continue this research and inclusion and equity and access, and you know, trying to become more attuned with a community-based lens. I think, you know, some of these themes around, you know, maybe the data repository is a possible, you know, new way that we were able to become more, you know, inclusive and accessible to diverse communities is a great reflection of, you know, the need, I think, to, you know, for us to continue to listen in to maybe the communities that we're not reaching, that were kind of highlighted in your presentation, Isabela, and learn more about how we can kind of continue to adapt our outreach or our relationships with school-based clinicians, or, you know, provider agencies that are working in all the communities of Massachusetts. So I think, you know, it's just a really important, I guess, signals to kind of continue to look at. And there's so much change that we need to continue to, you know, do in our you know, just the dialogue that we're having around you know, what we could improve. And you know, I just am so excited to be able to continue, you know, this kind of work, and you continue to adapt our programs informed by, you know, these studies. These are really impactful, and you know, I hope to see, you know, kind of this work continue, and you know, see how we can kind of change and adapt and become more attuned to our communities. So yeah, really, really wonderful work, and it's been such a pleasure to work with you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You've been a great help during this whole process.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Any other questions? Good job. You sort of managed the timing beautifully on this as well. What a great way to finish the week, or almost finish the week. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop the recording